Thank you, Ingo, very much for having me as part of your program. I'm honoured. Like looking through some of the speakers that you have, I think I have a little bit of insecurity here, but we'll see how this goes. So thank you all for taking the time, whether it's breakfast on the West Coast, lunchtime on the East Coast, or time when people just want to crack open a drink in Europe. My name's Ian. I by day, or whatever our routines are right now, I spend most of my time helping big companies design, launch new products, services, and ventures that really imagine how the world is changing and how those organizations need to change with them. Now, like, I find myself at a bit of a strange period where professionally I'm very excited about what can come next. I think we're at a point where, as I'll talk about a little bit more, we're at a new normal. However, I think also at this time it also makes everybody think, well, actually, what does this mean? Where do I go? What does it mean for me professionally? What does it mean for my career? What does it mean for my family? What does it mean for our countries? Which can make everybody actually like sit back, take a bit of time and think, well, actually, how do I need to be different? How do I need to change? How does my organization need to change? Before I get started though, I'd love to know where everybody's from today. So I'm based in Toronto. I did have a lovely view behind me, but Ingo said that cut out the view of my beautiful face. So where are people from today? Like, if you can let me know in the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, I'd love to know like where people are dialing in from.
I'm sorry, but chat doesn't work for me. Is it the same for everybody?
Yeah, chat is disabled, so
it's disabled. Yeah.
I think.
Well, I'm from Istanbul.
Thank you for taking the initiative and letting us know. I just re-enabled it, so you should be able to do that. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
So much for the troll measures. This was not intended to stop you from sharing.
Well, we're off to a great start, but it's lovely to see there's people from like Shanghai, Toronto, Houston, Mexico, Greece, New York, the Netherlands, like Istanbul, Montreal. It's a very multicultural group this today. What I'm going to talk to you about for a little bit, and we're going to make this a little bit interactive because I'd love to get your opinions, partly selfishly because it will help me understand a little bit more about the research that I've done and understand your opinions of it. But we're going to talk about the world has changed effectively. So over the past few weeks, you might have noticed you're spending a bit more time at home. So while I get my screen up here. Here we go. It works. A few weeks ago, the world changed. You probably already noticed that Ingo's managed to run 4 weeks worth of classes in that period of time. And I'd love to understand, like, many of you have probably become really good at this. Unmute yourself if you've been making quite a few batches of sourdough bread lately. I'm guessing that's not very many. Meanwhile, some of you will have had a lot of this. I know for myself, I spent a lot of time sitting at home going like, hang on a minute, what do I do now? As an extroverted person, I spend a lot of my time out in the world, speaking to people, being in different workplaces, going into people's homes, doing interviews and learning about how they work, play, love, shop, whatever that might be. But actually something really interesting happened over the past few weeks. It doesn't take us very long before we start to form new habits and behaviors or even opinions. There's loads of different studies that have been done around how long it takes people to form a new habit. Some would say we form a new habit in the space of 2 weeks. Some people say it takes as much as 9 months. Personally, I know that my habits of even the simple things, whether it's just I'm no longer a coffee drinker because my habit of going to my local coffee shop every day has kind of disappeared. But I created a new habit of drinking about 97 cups of tea every day. For others, it might be something that's a bit more active, like whether that's getting on their bike, spending more time with their family, spending more time reading instead of watching the television. For others, it might be some bigger habit that they're on the way towards working towards. I know a few people that have seen this time as a great opportunity to quit smoking, for instance. Being home with your wife and children will often do that to you because it's harder to nip outside for a quick cigarette. So I did something a few weeks ago where I really decided that it's a good it's a good opportunity to go understand what different people are doing, behaving, how they're thinking. So I got on the phone and hosted video chats, had WhatsApp conversations with interesting and opinionated people in the UK, the US, and Canada, to learn how they're responding to the changes impacting their day-to-day lives. Now today, given we've got so many people joining us from different parts of the world, I'm actually really interested in learning from you guys how this has impacted you. But we talked to them about their routines, what they're enjoying about them, the challenges that might be being created, how they're thinking and feeling, as well as how they're imagining this time is quite a good time to impact their future behavior. So we've talked about their home lives, their finances, their work, their families, healthcare, their travel, their political views, how they've responded to the news, as well as what companies and brands have really stood out to them. Now, I'm very aware this isn't the most scientific study in the world, but I believe by talking and spending time with people, you learn more than you could ever possibly have learned through doing some sort of traditional quantitative survey. Now, before I get into some of the things that we've learned, I'd love to understand from you guys, who here has seen things that have impacted how they're behaving? Like, how is your life? How are your lives changing over the course of the past 6 weeks with the impact of COVID?
Ian, do you want people to comment in the chat or just unmute themselves?
Either unmute yourselves or comment in the chat. Both works for me. We've got a relatively small group today, so I'm sure people can speak up. So we've got people having more video chats with friends and families. Like, I know that's happening for me a lot. People taking a 2 to 3 mile walk every day. I think many of us are becoming the webinar junkies. Stephanie, why don't you tell us a little bit about the webinars that you've been joining and how that's impacted you? So over the course of the past few weeks, with these conversations we've been having, we learned a few really interesting things. And I'd like to share a few of them with you now. Now, there's more detail that sits behind these. I'm always very happy to share the details. There's a link on there that I can also have Ingo send it out after this session if you want to read more. But what we found was that there's a lot of people that have had to change their behavior. They've been forced to change their behavior by the nature of the situation of current events. But also people are thinking about what does that do to them in the future? And I'm sure by joining a session like this one that we're hosting today and the 4 weeks that Ingo has hosted so far, you guys are all thinking the same too. So let me know in the chat function if some of these resonate with you more than others. But we've seen people buying local and staying local. And now that means that people they've recognized their local communities have been impacted, partly because they've been impacted themselves. But we're starting to see the way people go out and go out of their way to support their local communities in almost ways that they weren't necessarily doing before. Suddenly there's a huge piece of value being attached to the places in the community that maybe you didn't necessarily think about them being threatened before, but the idea of them not being around anymore almost pushes you to spend more time with them. So I look at my own local neighborhood in Toronto, and it feels like every single craft brewery has an enormous line outside on a Tuesday afternoon that you would never have seen before. We're starting to see record numbers of people researching local or staycations or nearcations. Pinterest, the data suggests that the boards that are being created, instead of people researching exotic vacations in far-flung locations, they're starting to look at things that are closer to home, dreaming and looking forward to when they can go get outdoors and explore their own backyard as the sort of lockdowns and quarantines start to lift. The deeper social connections, I think we've already heard about this from Cindy, but I think stories like that are amazing. That the way that almost our online behavior previously to coronavirus was often quite black and white. It drove us to being, do we agree or disagree? It didn't allow us to understand the nuance that was necessarily being involved. We didn't necessarily take the time to spend time with our friends and our families, whether that was in person or digitally. And now suddenly that everything has been stripped back, we're making those deeper social connections. One of my favorite people that we spoke to was my business partner's great aunt, who's, I think she's in her late 70s or early 80s, based down in Texas, not terribly tech savvy. And she suddenly discovered the joys of Zoom, whether that's speaking to friends and family, playing bingo, or even dialing into her local Sunday church service through Zoom conversations. Seeing this technical adoption of tools that have always been forced upon us, and figuring out how we want to make them work for ourselves versus how technologists have designed them for us. We're only in March and April, yet it's been a chance for a New Year's resolution. We've seen effectively people who in January might have said, I want to lose weight, I want to quit smoking, I want to find a new job. It's a time for me to reevaluate my life and make a big change. Now, January is often a terrible time to do that because you must feel pressure to make them. But instead, now people are having the time to think them through. So we're starting to see people that are, because their daily routines and their rituals and their habits are being forced to change, actually the New Year's resolution is becoming something that's much easier to sustain and to manage. And I think there's much greater optimism that people can see them through into the rest of the year. I know for sure that there's people out there who say, every year I try and give up drinking, or I try and drink less, or I try and do things that make me more healthy. And by January the 15th, it's all over. We're now 6 weeks into this thing, and most of these people are keeping up those behaviors. So it'll be interesting to see, by having a longer amount of time, will that continue into their futures. I have a question for everybody. Who's enjoying working from home? We found that when we were speaking to people, it was really interesting. You have this spectrum of the ones who are loving it and the ones who are really struggling with it. And I think you also have this, like, obviously the middle in between of people called out getting time back from their days where, because they're not in the car every day and in traffic making the commute. And others called out the fact that because they're not on a train for 45 minutes every day, they're not necessarily getting that time that prepares them to do their work. So they're finding new ways and trying to create the different sort of habits that give them the ability to read and to soak up information. And then others have to find other ways to create the serendipitous opportunities to, whether it's getting the little tidbits of information about what's happening in the workplace, or whether that's being able to have a conversation with colleagues that doesn't necessarily feel so planned. So I think this will be a really interesting place of, as we go on longer and longer into this period of working from home, what does it look like when we return to the workplace? There's also an interesting selective nostalgia. So things that we didn't necessarily know that we cared about before, suddenly we're really caring about them. And things that actually people thinking we go back to the normal and everything will be okay and we'll just see this V-shaped return. I think the longer this goes on, people are suggesting that that's not what they expect. The one that was really interesting to me was people who were really big into their movies. And as home televisions got cheaper and surround sounds, they stopped going to the cinema as often. They built their own movie watching environments, whether that was in their downstairs converted basements, or whether that was turning effectively a studio apartment into a very small cinema. And that became a really important part of their lives. Then now that they can't go to the cinema, suddenly there's this huge craving to go back and spend time in a place that has other people around you, brings that atmosphere, whether it's the smell of the popcorn or whether it's other people in the space with you, or being able to have that social environment around you that isn't just being in your home. So I think the parts of nostalgia that people have will be really interesting things that when we come back to whatever a new normal might be, the things that were going out of fashion could be more in fashion. Likewise, we're seeing this greater conscious turning into action. So I think the last 2019 was the year of the environmentalist movement really becoming something that was very, very interesting and actually becoming quite powerful. Whether that was people attending the events that took place across the US that were led by Greta Thunberg, or whether it was just seeing more of the impact of humans having what they do onto the environment. And now that we've stepped back from things, suddenly that consciousness stepped up. We've seen how we can all behave and change and be different when threatened by a virus that has a very immediate impact on a portion of the population. And I think that translation is making people think differently about what is the bigger picture and the longer term impact they can possibly have. So when we spoke to people, they were talking about, because they're at home so much more often, if I move my camera around here, you'd see the amount of extra recycling that I've ended up piling up by spending 7 days a week at home for 6 weeks in a row. Now we're recognizing that impact that we have on the environment in a way that when we were rushed and running to and from places, and the impact of our consumption wasn't necessarily seen in one place, is a really interesting way of how we will move forward coming out of this period. Now, the latter two pieces I think are probably less interesting for individuals, but they're specifically more interesting for people who work in large organizations, especially people in marketing functions. So I found that there's brands that have done things in the past few weeks that I think are a little bit of a turn-off. We spoke to people who would say, you know what, all those emails I got and that bombarded my inbox, it was from brands I didn't care about telling me they're there for me. One person we spoke to in Toronto had his own business. It was kind of relatively early days on it. It was quite fragile and needed some support from his bank. He'd had an email from his bank saying they're there for him, they're going to change what they do. When he'd made that phone call and tried to get help, they weren't actually there from them. So what the PR teams are doing during this period of time, coupled with what companies are doing at this time, don't necessarily match up. And when people really need help and support, that's a really interesting time for you understand whether the value proposition is actually substantiated or the marketing is substantiated by the value proposition. And then likewise, people are starting to think about the short-term crisis, so what happens over this course of a period of a few weeks. Some of the people that we spoke to were struggling to make their rent payments or their mortgage payments, or they were recognizing their cash flow was taking a significant impact, and they were starting to draw down on overdraft and credit card facilities to pay the bills, even in the matter of the first few weeks. Meanwhile, others were looking at what the longer term prospects were for. One person we spoke to worked in an entertainment company that owns casinos, and he was looking at it saying, my job isn't necessarily going to rebound back to normal. I have to reskill and retool and think about what comes next. So I think all those different ways in terms of how people are behaving, from whether it's small little things they can do in their day-to-days from buying local through to bigger term career prospects about where they go next, are really interesting. And this is a piece of work that I'm just continuing to do in the background. So I'd love to learn from you guys on this call today. Like, do these things resonate with you? Do you see yourselves in some of these themes? Or are there perhaps other ways that you think you're being impacted at this time? I'm going to pull the screen share back now, and if people would like to share by unmuting themselves, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, if people would like to share in the chat function, it would be great to open it up. I think it's really interesting, Stephanie, about the real estate market there. I know a lot of people have been looking at house prices at this time and almost wondering of what does it do to them, or like people who've just bought, has it impacted their investment in a negative way, or is it going to open it up to people who are still trying to just get on the housing ladder, for instance? I spent a lot of time in my own career reimagining what the future of the real estate industry could be. And living in Toronto, I'm looking out my window at downtown, and there's skyscrapers, there's more cranes in Toronto now than there are in any other city in North America. And then suddenly, is it going to be a point where actually people don't want to commute into the city? People don't want to be living in small condos downtown. And there's almost a trend to go back to the suburbs or living in smaller towns and cities that don't require being pulled into that downtown core in a hub. Last week, I was running an online event, and we had a poll on the event asking where people's companies were. Were they kind of firefighting to just keep everything going? Were they not changing very much, or were they reimagining what the future could be? And it was I didn't expect it to be so divided. Where I think we almost had it split a third. Where it was some people are really taking this opportunity to think about the future and go, well, why did we do that, and why should we keep doing that? Yeah. And others are not necessarily taking it, and they're almost going, well, we behaved like this before, how do we take this policy and make it digital? So it's a really interesting question. I think it's going to it'll take a bit of time for us to as a society to figure that one out, but I suspect the ones that are more adaptable with it, they're the ones that are going to be seeing the promotions into the future, rather than the leaders that are much more reactionary, saying that, oh no, you have to digitally check in. One person I spoke to actually they had no working from home policy in their company. And so everybody had to be in the office every morning for a 8:30 a.m. meeting, so that when they went digital, they kept that policy in force because they thought it would be really good for teamwork. But without thinking that at 8:30 in the morning, many of those people had kids who were trying to learn from home, and the physical doesn't translate to the digital very well, or doesn't always, at least. So that's a great pontification point.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing. So what I'd like to move on to is like what this new normal might look like. And I think there's three kind of key themes that will be successful if we can go all in on. And that might mean really changing who we are and how we behave today. But people who can embody those all-in themes will be really successful. Now, I'm very conscious that I am a tradition. My background is in management consulting. It's very easy for a management consultant to profess that they know what the future holds. So I'm not going to be that person telling you I know everything, because I absolutely don't. But I think over the next course of the next few weeks, we'll see every management consultancy or digital agency or expert trying to tell us what the new or the next normal might be. And to be honest, we're all making it up. We're all fibbing. We're all figuring out as we go. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have to have something that we want to aim towards. One of my favorite books that I've read recently was by the economist John Kay. He talked about the consideration of obliquity, which was to be successful and to achieve your goals in life. You don't necessarily make them by setting the individual steps. You make them by setting the big, ambitious goal, and then you navigate and you tack towards that as things come towards us. So instead, I think by the way that we can have that really positive future ahead of us, so we can figure out how life works, how love works, how our careers and our employment works, how we play, how we lead, how we travel, whatever that might be. There's a few values that will make us more successful. And that's what I'd like to share with you for the remainder of this conversation. Now, the first one of these is culture. So over the last few weeks, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but we haven't really gone to any sporting events. We haven't gone to any gigs. We haven't been able to have our friends around for dinner. And I think no matter how much of an introvert you are, actually that's a huge impact on people's day-to-day lives. So if we consider what it looks like when lockdown restrictions are lifted, whenever they may be, that could be in the coming weeks, as in some cases in Europe, it could be months and months out, depending on how cautious governments are in lifting these things. But I think the power of those simple pleasures, whether it's even going to a mediocre gig, enjoying space in a park again, attending a very average sporting event, it's all going to feel so new. The impact on our senses of having spent so much time at home is going to make us hypersensitive when we go out back into that world and have people and crowds and activity happening around us. And really, that's kind of already happening online. Like as Cindy talked about with her online dance parties, like those greater amounts of community that are happening online kind of remind me of the days of the early dial-up internet. And while I look about 12, I am just about old enough to remember the early dial-up era of the internet. That when you loaded a page, it took so long to load the page, you'd almost invested that time in creating that page to load. And therefore you wanted to soak up all the information on it. You spent the time reading it, knowing that if you kept on scrolling down or clicking through, that when you did that, it took you to something that like took longer to load. And in some people's cases, they didn't have all you can download internet, so it was costing them more money. As the internet advanced and everything became available to us and it all became abundant, actually we became in this world of we didn't really read anything. That's why everybody on Twitter thinks they're an epidemiologist, or as of yesterday, they all think they're an oil speculator. But actually we want to be part of something. We want to see when other people are being part of it. And like that behavior of whether it's people on their balconies in Toronto and at 7:30 every night applauding, or whether it's people in Italy playing tennis on rooftops or whatever it might be, we're wanting to get that culture back into our lives. And as that culture comes back into our lives, as these restrictions lift, we'll care about it so much more. And I think in doing that, we'll have moved beyond that style of feeling that things are curated. So to be cool in the millennial age was to actually detach yourself from things. It was to like wear things that were unbranded. It was to remove yourself or disassociate yourself from things that perhaps didn't seem as cool or you didn't want to be around. But actually now, as people go back out into the world, actually we might want a bit more of that unedited feel of things, because right now you're sitting into my apartment and the exposed parts of the HVAC equipment. I've been on video chats with people who I didn't know had curly hair, who spend time a lot in the morning straightening it when they go to the office. We've taken our guard down a little bit. So the unedited feel of things, we want to see the rawness. It's going to be celebrated when people bring that to the crowd. We want to see people's enthusiasm. It's not very interesting for people to be like behind a screen almost. And the sharing of things isn't going to just be reserved for the digital world, but we wanting to share and love those experiences because we know how it feels now that we've had them taken away from us. Totally. Like, I've seen people on Zoom calls over the past few weeks that I've never seen them out of a suit, and I've now seen them on video calls that kind of reminiscent of the BBC interview where the guy has his child walking in the back. But I've seen people who I don't associate with that kind of side of them, and I've seen their parenting side as they've said, "Excuse me" for a few minutes and gone to attend to a family matter on a call. And to me, like, that almost makes me think way more of them versus when they have that shield or the defense or the guards up when they're in the office. So I think that'll be a really interesting part of it when we come back to it. The next one is all in leadership. So for me, coming as a consultant to this world, like, we spent, and it's done very well for me as a consultant, but we've spent the last decade or more in a world of this fast and thin thinking. Even right now, down in the eastern seaboard of the US, we have McKinsey advising governors like Andrew Cuomo on how to lift the lockdowns and how New York as a state can manage themselves against Trump's leadership for what happens as part of this pandemic. But that world of management consultants led us to, we relied on them to put their name and their brand on things, because if McKinsey said it, or if IBM said it, or if Deloitte said it, or BCG said it, it must be smart. But what it ended up doing was we had senior leaders in organizations prioritizing them looking okay and them keeping themselves safe over what the bigger, longer term opportunities and futures were. For a long time, we did the safe thing, not the daring thing. We created terms like best practice because it's almost like looking at the kid that is top of the class and you're borrowing his homework because he's normally right. Therefore, I'm going to look over his shoulder and check that he's right. Mark Andreessen wrote an amazing thing over the weekend about how we stopped building things and now is the time to build things. Or at least that's kind of true in the Western world. Infrastructure hasn't happened in cities. We've seen scandals in the press around how health departments that recognized the pandemic was coming more than a decade ago and stockpiled health equipment, but in recent years haven't replenished those stocks. In many cases, they gave them away or let them go out of date so that when something did come along, we got hit really, really hard. Many people will look at what you would consider there was the golden quarter of advancement, which was when, following the Second World War, scientific advancements were abundant. And then going into the 70s following the oil crisis, it all slowed down and it stalled. We almost train people to be risk averse. We train people to hoard their assets. We train them to not invest and take risks and build something bigger and better. And that comfort and that convenience has made things a bit softer. The rules that we have become more complex, that you look at regulation in many spaces, whether that's to bring it back to the housing market in Toronto, the regulation and the rules around building new properties here are insane. Public service almost, in whether you believe in conscription or not, but it used to be that people grew up and at a young age they went to serve their country. By serving your country in an army, 18-year-olds from wealthy backgrounds were mixed with 18-year-olds from poor backgrounds and from different geographies and regions as part of a country and a culture, and it brought them together. That all became optional. So this leadership has become a veneer almost of how do I advance my career, how do I look good versus how do I do good. So I personally think our future leadership will look very, very different. Over the past few weeks, we've seen things that happen that have been unprecedented. and we've seen leaders step into the breach, whether you agree with their politics or not, that big thinking has been much more powerful and change-worthy than any form of design thinking, which often made something look a little bit nicer, or it polished it, or it did the thing that wasn't necessarily risky. We'll see imagination and ingenuity. It won't be good enough to sort of incrementally improve something anymore. It won't be good enough to sort of do the logical, rational thing. We'll celebrate leaders that have gone and taken a big, bold step, designed a new future, and found a way to make it happen in an ingenious way, because our resources are going to be constrained somewhat coming out of what will end up being a big financial crisis. And I actually personally think the age of the leaders that we trust will come to the fore again. Not necessarily the leaders that tell us what we want to hear, and we put our capital behind those people that are telling us what we think we like. There's going to be so many inconvenient truths that come out of this scenario and situation that the leaders that we require to be successful be those ones that we put our trust behind and we know they're doing it for the right reasons, versus the ones that might just be speaking up for the little guy. So perhaps this could be the end of the age of populism, and we start to see the age of leaders that we might not like them, but we know they're doing the right thing. I don't know if people agree or disagree with me right now.
Yeah, there's a lively discussion in the chat, and I would love to encourage some of the people to bring up their comments.
And you've given me a lovely segue. I'm conscious of our time as well, but you've given me a lovely segue into our last piece, which is all around all-in change. So as we've seen, the governments have stepped in and they've made huge impacts on trying to stabilize the economy, almost in a way that they haven't necessarily thought through what the consequences of that will be longer term, because it was required right then. And that's not very common for governments to do. We've seen big brands step in to support supply chains. We've seen people across the world who stepped in to buy local, support their economy, volunteer, help out people, which we weren't necessarily seeing before. And we might not necessarily thought that through. We don't know what it's going to look like when the lockdowns lift. But imagine if everybody stopped doing that support. The consequences would be huge. And how do you have the story of okay, Amazon's going to go back to doing what Amazon does, governments are going to go back to playing it safe? Suddenly you can't necessarily do that in the same way. So that all-in culture and that all-in leadership, that gives us an environment that's all-in, made for right for all-in change effectively. It's easy to say it, it's fucking hard to do it. But to do that, it's going to require a few things. So we're going to see some really strange political alliances, where that's what that looks like from people who've been populist, working to hold on to power, with others coming up through the political ranks. But you'll be surprised by how much a polarized electorate can actually have in common. I think over the next period of time, being a Brit, albeit I don't live in the UK anymore, I actually believe that what comes next from this is probably going to be the thing that heals the great Brexit divide that damaged the country over the last few years. The divergent thinking that's going to be required so we can move beyond the consequences that we've created for ourselves. So now we're in this point where even on a company level, I'll pick a small thing, but the taking the cashier and the checkout person away from being in the grocery store to moving towards a touchscreen. Suddenly that doesn't look so cool when we're celebrating frontline grocery store workers and we don't really want to touch a grubby screen anymore. And then how that moves forward is, will the fringe become more of the mainstream? And as we already touched upon, the small nations punching above their weight at the diplomatic table. Now, this is a period of time when we'll see China come to the fore as being effectively the new major global power. And in the past, we've often seen the former major global power trying to keep them in check. I don't necessarily know if we'll see that anymore, but where we will see that protection of whether it's citizens' rights or different ways of doing things, that might be coming from politicians like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, or it'll come from the digital economy in Estonia, compared to the traditional heavyweights at the table being leaders from the UK, France, Germany, Russia, or the US. So I think that's a really interesting place to look. Now, before Ingo kicks me off of here, what I just like to say is I believe this has always been a technique of mine in the work that I do. So everybody can do this. What I encourage is going out beyond your comfort zone, finding the people to go and talk to and observe that are very different from you, remove some of that bias from how you might see things today, and record and document what you see. Really focus on what surprises you and how it's different from your own behavior. Now, I often run a technique called breaking assumptions, and to do that, you effectively look at what those assumptions are today, what are the core things that you hold to be true. And if you flipped it around the other way, they might not exist tomorrow. And if you did that, what would the implications be for that future world? And if that future world were to be a thing, what would that mean for you as an individual? What would it mean for your family? What would it mean for your career? What would it mean for your team at the office? And how would it mean for like how you bring that together and how you embody those values and make the most of it? So hopefully that's something that's interesting to leave you with. Thank you for joining for the hour that we had today. And if you'd like to learn more, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. And I'm sure Ingo will send out some details after this session with some of the content that I shared. I always appreciate like a healthy debate around some of this. I deliberately try and be a bit provocative with it. So I would love to continue some of those conversations that we started already. Thank you very much.